Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the sixth episode of Diplomatically Speaking With. My name is Zain, and as always, I'll be the host of Diplomatically Speaking With, or DSW for short. DSW is a series of interviews with the diplomatic corps in Malaysia. For each DSW, we'll be talking about the history, context, and opportunities of the bilateral relations between Malaysia and foreign countries. DSW is brought to you by KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific, better known as KSI, a top-ranked think tank based in Malaysia, and I am the Director of External Relations. For your information, KSI is an independent think tank with a vision to build better nations in Asia Pacific. Today, we are diplomatically speaking with the High Commissioner of South Africa to Malaysia, His Excellency Mr. Dave Malcomson, on everything South Africa-Malaysia relations. Excellency, how are you?
Very well, thank you. And thank you very much, Zaim, for hosting me today. It's a pleasure to be able to meet with the KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific. I know that you're a very prestigious institution, so I'm looking forward to the exchange between us.
Likewise, High Commissioner, we're excited to have you as well. Let me start with the first question. Excellency, do you mind sharing a little bit about your background?
No, thank you very much. Obviously, I'm from South Africa, born and bred in Johannesburg, worked in Pretoria, obviously most of my working life. The last 30 years, I've been a career diplomat and now have ended up in Malaysia, previously having been posted in Beijing and prior to that to Zimbabwe, but primarily during my career working on issues of the African Union, on issues of the new Partnership for Africa's Development and the strategic partnerships with Africa. But then more recently, before Malaysia, working on the BRICS initiative, that's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa initiative, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and IBSA, the India, Brazil, South Africa initiative. But it's a pleasure to be here in Malaysia.
It's fascinating diversity of experiences. You mentioned Beijing, Zimbabwe, African Union, all the way to BRICS initiative. Do you mind just sharing a little bit about your appointment as the High Commissioner of South Africa to Malaysia? And I know that you are recently appointed in March this year. Maybe can you just walk us through sort of the moments before, or the sort of the context right before you were appointed, and then what has been sort of the top three things that are important for you as the High Commissioner of South Africa to Malaysia?
No, thank you very much. I mean, for any career diplomat, it's the highlight of your career to be chosen by your president to represent your country in another country, to represent the interests of your people and your region. So, of course, when I was approached by the ministry to represent South Africa in Malaysia, I was extremely excited. But of course, I was also very excited because I've spent quite a bit of time in Asia. I've seen a lot of Southeast Asia. I'd been to Malaysia previously as part of President Mbeki's delegation to the NAM summit in 2003, where we also had meetings with the Prime Minister at the time, Dr. Tun Mahathir. And I was well versed with Malaysia, having worked with them as well in the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and being well aware that there were many issues that we shared in common when it comes to things like South-South cooperation, the concerns and needs of the developing countries, the same solidarity we share with the liberation struggle of the Palestinian people. So I was, as I say, very excited to hear that I'd been asked to come to Malaysia. And of course, I didn't have to think longer than 30 seconds to agree to that.
That's that's always heartening to hear. When Malaysia is sort of top of the preferences for many high commissioners and ambassadors. Sorry, High Commissioner, can you walk us through when you joined, when you were appointed earlier this year? What are sort of the three things that you thought were or you feel are important for you to achieve in your term as High Commissioner?
No, thank you. I mean, that's obviously the first question one has to ask when preparing to undertake the task. I think the most fundamental priority is to strengthen the bilateral and multilateral relationship between Malaysia and South Africa, and also, frankly, between Malaysia and Africa. Obviously, that's something that most ambassadors or high commissioners would say, but in our case, I think it's particularly important because of the history where the relationship, I would characterize perhaps as the golden era, was between 1994 and 2005, where the relationship was very strong, very vibrant, very strategic. And unfortunately, for whatever reason on both sides, we seem to have lost that focus and urgency following on, where today one could say we are a bit stagnant in the relationship. So it's very much a case of having to find ways of reviving the relationship. And luckily, in interacting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at Wismaputra and other interlocutors in Malaysia, I'm finding that there's a similar feeling on the Malaysian side, that it is time that we revisit the relationship, we reprioritize each other, and that we re-energize the relationship. Of course, the second priority, I think, as for most diplomats, is the economic diplomacy or commercial diplomacy. Trying to get the trade and investment and tourism figures up again. They had been looking very good going into 2019, but obviously since the pandemic, things have taken quite a hit in terms of the trade, investment and tourism. So there has to be a focus on reviving that and getting that back up and running. And then thirdly, I think there are particular opportunities. And I think for us in South Africa, working with Malaysia, and particularly working with Malaysia in ASEAN, we see the halal sector as a very significant sector for cooperation. I think what many Malaysians don't realize is that although South Africa only has a relatively small Muslim population of about 500,000, we are in the top 5 to 7 global producers of halal products. And 60% of all the products in our retail markets, in the supermarkets and so on, are all halal certified. And 3 of our halal certification bodies are recognized by JAKIM. So there's definitely opportunities there in the halal sector. And I think in a related sector, the whole question of franchising. We have a very sophisticated franchising sector in South Africa. I think most Malaysians will be aware of Nando's, which is currently present in Malaysia. And that's just but one example of a very vibrant franchising sector, which I think then provides opportunities for opening more franchises in Malaysia, making South Africa more visible to Malaysians, and then vice versa, helping Malaysian companies that wish to open franchises in South Africa. So I think those are really the 3 main areas that I'll be looking at and that I have been looking at since I got here in January this year.
Very, and thank you for sharing, because it's so strategic. You mentioned about the bilateral multinational ties, investment in tourism, the halal sector, very targeted and focused. And I appreciate that you also mentioned about the golden era, which was between 1994, when South Africa transitioned into the modern democracy that it is today, and 2005. If you can just walk us through sort of that golden era, I'm curious to know. You mentioned very vibrant, very strategic. Could you elaborate in terms of the levels of collaboration and cooperation? Because this goes back to the historical context between the 2 countries. And I know that people-to-people relations go before 1994, but if you can walk us through sort of the golden era, it's interesting to better understand so that we can have some context.
No, absolutely. And I think I want to take it even further back than the golden era to the era that we were both under Dutch colonial rule. There's a 350, 400-year history of linkages and cultural exchanges between our 2 countries, often not by choice. I mean, the Dutch used to take what they called imams from the Malay archipelago that were causing problems in the Malay archipelago and then bringing them to Cape Town, to the Cape Colony as it then was. So there's a very vibrant community in South Africa, even today, which is called the Cape Malay community, that their links, their historical links go back to that time of 350 years ago. And those imams from the Malay archipelago, those people that were brought as laborers, as slaves to the Cape Colony, form what today is called the Cape Malay community. Because of that, there's the cultural linkages, there's the cuisine, there's many elements of the cuisine in the Cape that Malays would recognize. There's even elements of the language. Some of the words like blatjan, pisang, asbak, all come from the Malay ties. So there was that historical cultural linkage that we had. But then, of course, Malaysia was very strong in the anti-apartheid movement and in supporting us in our liberation struggle. So that once we achieved our freedom in 1994, Malaysia was very quick to put in place the diplomatic relations between ourselves. And those relations then grew incrementally between 94 and say 2005. The relationship, I think, was also founded on personal relationships. Dr. Tun Mahathir had a very good relationship with former President Mandela, with former President Mbeki. We worked together in things like the non-aligned movement in the Commonwealth and later in the Indian Ocean Rim Association. We had similar ideas around the concerns and needs of the South-South cooperation. There were the initiatives from Malaysia's side on the Langkawi Dialogue, on the Southern African International Dialogue. And all of these things sought to bring us together. We also worked very closely in terms of the similarities that we have as societies. We have these multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-language cultures with similar needs and development needs. And because of that, we cooperated in areas like your Bumiputra policy with our broad-based Black economic empowerment. We learned from Malaysia on your Big Fast Results model to develop our own Operation Pakisa in the oceans economy and in other sectors of the economy. We helped Malaysia when it came to developing a transport policy. We worked together on things like the offset policies when it comes to investments. So there was all of this going on. And on top of that, there was a lot of investment between the two countries, but particularly Malaysia into South Africa. And at a point in time, I think Malaysia was the 7th biggest investor in South Africa. But then after 2005, particularly after 2008, with the economic crisis, the global financial crisis, there was a degree of disinvestment. So we lost that preeminent role of Malaysia investing in the South African economy. We do have that today. There are still investments, but not to the degree that there were. And I think on both sides, there was a certain lack of focus. We chose to look more to our internal issues. We chose to look more at our regions. In the case of Malaysia, you were looking more at ASEAN and to an extent, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and some of your other partners, China, Australia, and so on. And equally, we had a more intense focus on Africa as we developed the African Union, as we developed the regional economic communities, and then other initiatives like BRICS. So I think because of that change of focus, because of the turn inward, dealing with some issues, we lost that vibrancy and that energy that we had in our bilateral relationship. So as I say, I think we're now at the point, both sides recognize that we need to adopt measures now politically, economically, and otherwise to re-energize the relationship, revitalize it, and move us forward.
Thank you for sharing such a elaborate sharing of the shared culture and heritage between both sides. You mentioned about the Cape Malays. I especially enjoyed when you mentioned about the 300 years of shared histories, Dutch taking the errant imams from the Malay archipelago to South Africa, regions of South Africa. Mentioned about the 94 when Malaysia formed the relations with South Africa, the personal relations between Tun Mahathir and Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki in various multilateral organizations such as the Non-Aligned Movement, Commonwealth, South-South Cooperation. You mentioned about shared diversity that we have, multiracial, multi-religious, multicultural. Interestingly, you also mentioned about South Africa when it comes to policies, for example, the Black economic empowerment, drawing from lessons from Malaysia's NDP. You mentioned about the heavy investment from Malaysia into South Africa, being the 7th biggest investor at one point. Now that we were talking about sort of that economic cooperation, could you maybe elaborate in terms of present day, current times, when it comes to trade and economic relations between Malaysia and South Africa? If you can maybe share what are the particular industries or sectors that are relevant for both countries, I think that would be interesting to hear.
No, thank you very much. Obviously, having said what I've said, it's not that nothing's happening. So there is still quite a degree of trade going on, investment and other interactions in the political and other spheres. The trade primarily has been in Malaysia's favor. If one looks at the trade balance, it has been in Malaysia's favor. The imports that South Africa brings in from Malaysia are largely in sectors like palm oil, oil in general, petroleum products, auto parts, clothing, animal and vegetable fats, and so on. In terms of what we export to Malaysia, it's products in the manganese field, the concentrates in manganese, concentrates in tin, stainless steel. We have quite a large export of volume of exports of fruit and vegetables and various types of sugars, sucrose and sugars to Malaysia. The trade was growing quite happily from 2016 to 2019, but of course with the pandemic that has dropped off. So one can see in 2019, the value of the trade between us was around 22.4 billion rand. But by 2020, that had dropped to 18.2 billion rand. So there's work to do to regain the lost revenues between us in the imports and exports. And I think the areas that I've identified earlier and some other areas I can maybe talk about going forward will enable us to grow that trade again. And I think there are massive opportunities in trade that we've been missing because of the lack of focus. On the investment side, we still have quite a significant investment in a manganese smelter in Sarawak. We have investment, Sanlam, a South African company, has a partnership with MCIS Life Insurance in Malaysia. Of course, there's the Nando's, which isn't strictly an investment, but it's a South African company in Malaysia. We also have an agricultural project, a Greenfields farm, that's growing fresh produce that doesn't use pesticides and chemicals. So that taps into the new way of looking at agriculture and food that's not tainted with all sorts of chemicals and so on. And there are a number of other polyethylene and other chemical projects where we have investments in Malaysia. Equally, from the Malaysian side, the biggest investment, I think, is the Petronas investment in the Engen petroleum company in South Africa. There's also investments in the construction and leisure industry. And there's currently a Malaysian company that's working on a project in the Durban harbour area. So those are things going forward. There are also smaller investments in palm oil beneficiation and in auto products that are in South Africa. The tourism side, unfortunately, I don't think is anywhere near what it could be between us. But it was growing. But in 2019, we had quite a substantial growth in the tourism. But of course, now since the pandemic, the tourism has dropped to a very insignificant amount between us. And obviously, that's the existing portfolio, but there's many other areas that I think we can look at together going forward when one looks at small and medium enterprises, the whole question of green technology, of blue economy, of the digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution. I think there are many opportunities in that and other fields.
This very, very interesting points you mentioned, from trade numbers to investment numbers. Interestingly, you mentioned about tourism suffering before the pandemic. I guess the same can be said in other countries as well. But I think from what you've shared, I think it's fair to say, I think the trade cooperation is considerable, and I think South Africa and Malaysia are in some ways strong trading partners, and of course there's much to be desired in terms of strengthening that relation. But I think both countries are strong partners when it comes to economic relations. I want to touch on you mentioned just now about Nando's, and I thought that was super interesting. Sort of this Nando's is sort of the symbol of soft power of South Africa in Malaysia, because a lot of Malaysians love Nando's. If you can touch a little bit, not about Nando's, but maybe about the cultural cooperation between South Africa and Malaysia. And earlier you alluded to the Cape Malays, which I find fascinating, that we have you have Malays on the other side of the, other side of the world, so to speak. Can you talk a little bit more about the cultural cooperation between South Africa and Malaysia? If you can also touch on, maybe, are there any initiatives that Malaysians hearing this should know about what South Africa is doing in this country, and maybe also anything that's relevant when it comes to this topic?
No, again, I have to say that on the cultural cooperation, and possibly by extension, people-to-people cooperation and educational cooperation, there's a lot more we could be doing with each other, particularly if one looks at what we have already that's been given to us as a legacy from that Cape Malay linkage, from the cultural, the cuisine, the language linkages, the historical linkages, the similar historical experiences, the similar experience that our people have had in terms of colonialism, in terms of what we need today for development of our people, particularly in South Africa's case, and to some extent in Malaysia's case, the development of previously disadvantaged communities. I think the whole area of culture and people-to-people cooperation and education, skills development, exchange of capacity and human resource development. These are all areas that I think we need to give more attention to in the future. We also, apart from the Cape Malay linkage, we also have a historical legacy of a big Indian community, and particularly around the Durban area. So like Malaysia, we have this blending of cultures, of cuisines, of languages, of people. And I just need to re-emphasize the similarities that we share when it comes to this characteristics of countries being multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multi-religious, as it were. There's much that I think we can explore and do together there. And I think both countries, in terms of tourism, have the opportunity to offer particular cultural experiences as one aspect of tourism, before you even look at the wildlife and the scenery and the adventure tourism, ecotourism, the other things that we have to offer. There's that very basic need of people to engage with each other and to understand each other and to share similarities and areas where they can identify each other in each other. There is a certain amount of exchange happening at the student level. There are South African students that study in Malaysia at various universities. There's also Malaysian students that study in South African madrasas. South African madrasas apparently have a very good reputation, and I think there's quite a significant amount of Malaysian children studying in the madrasas in South Africa, which I hope will help us with mutual understanding and sending out the message that in Malaysia and South Africa, we both have partners that understand each other. Of course, there's other initiatives that we've been working on for a while, such as a memorandum of understanding on cultural cooperation. There's a memorandum of understanding on the mutual recognition of qualifications that we're working on. I think there's ideas around cooperation in science, technology, and innovation, around how to use current business ties for the training of interns. All of these things, I think, will help us to grow the mutual understanding and the linkages and contacts between our peoples that would be so essential going forward.
And what you mentioned the cultural linkages, people-to-people linkages, and also mentioned about the diversity that we both share. You also touched a little bit about there's the exchange programs between the countries and also the MOUs. When I was hearing this, High Commissioner, what is the pitch? If you had to pitch not to policymakers in Malaysia, but to everyday Malaysians in terms of those interested to learn South Africa in whatever facet, be traveling there for tourism purposes, studying there. What do you think is the pitch that you wanna, if this was a short pitch that you wanna share with everyday Malaysians? So the key here is not policymakers, but everyday Malaysians. What do you think should be the pitch? What do you think should Malaysians know about South Africa? Bearing in mind we've mentioned about the diversity and economic cooperation, but what do you think should the everyday Malaysians know about South Africa that you think they don't know and they should know?
Well, I think that the the main message that I would give to ordinary day Malaysians is that there's an old phrase that we used to use, that South Africa is a world in one country. So any Malaysian coming to South Africa would experience a whole range of rich new experiences, but would also not feel totally alienated, because there would be a lot about South Africa they would recognize in the similar experiences, in the similar needs, the similar concerns, the similar historical and cultural linkages and experiences. But of course, they would have a very exciting product, if you want to call it that, or an exciting time if they came to South Africa across a whole range of experiences, be it ecotourism, be it adventure tourism, be it the traditional tourism of what we call mountain, beach, and wildlife. We have some of the best game reserves in the world, where you can see the Big Five live in its wild and in the wild environment. You can have the most wonderful coastline experiences, the most wonderful experiences in the mountains. But then you'll find in the cities, very rich, cosmopolitan, diversified cities with strong infrastructure, with strong economies, and with people that are very much like Malaysians. People that love family, people that love food, people that love having a party. They're very warm and welcoming. So I think the Malaysians will recognize much of themselves in South Africans. And I think in the time that we did have a focus on each other, there was this mutual recognition that we can be very good partners, because there's so much we share, there's mindsets and experiences that we share, and therefore there are solutions for challenges and problems into the future that we can share and also learn from each other. I think there are many areas where we can learn from each other, be it Malaysia learning from us when it comes to animal husbandry and breeding programs, or us learning from Malaysia when it comes to how to grow the small and medium scale enterprises in South Africa, and the industrialization and manufacturing path that Malaysia took, I think is very instructive for us. And there's other areas of our economy where the Malaysian economy can learn from us. I know if one talks about pharmaceutical corporation, for example, we have something called the BioVac Institute that is involved with research and manufacturing of vaccines, which is an area that perhaps we could cooperate on in the future. But there are many such examples of areas where we could cooperate that I've mentioned. And perhaps if you'll allow me just to elaborate again on some of the sort of areas where we could cooperate further. As I said, the most exciting opportunity for me is the halal sector. And I see an area for mutual cooperation, for mutual benefit in developing halal parks in South Africa, where joint ventures could be formed between Malaysian and South African companies, where the benefit to the Malaysian company would be that South Africa is the most diversified economy in Africa. We have extensive transport and infrastructural linkages into the African continent. We have one of the biggest banking sectors that is South African in the African continent. We have some of the biggest cell phone companies in the African continent. We also have some of the biggest retail shopping centers and shopping companies that are in the African market. So the Malaysian companies could leverage all of that to get Malaysian products through the halal parks and further up into Africa, bearing in mind that there's about 600 million Muslims in Africa. So it's a huge market that I don't think Malaysia has looked at tapping at all yet. And just as Malaysia sees itself as a gateway to ASEAN, we very much see ourselves as a gateway to Africa, which would assist Malaysian companies. Equally then, South African companies would be able to utilize the fact that I think Malaysia is regarded worldwide as the gold standard for halal certification. So the South African companies could leverage that partnership, that relationship, to put a stamp of quality on what are quality products, and then be able to bring them into the Malaysian market at a competitive price. And they would be products then that the Malaysian consumer would trust because of the relationship. And again, using the gateway analogy, you could then also take products up into the ASEAN market using various transport linkages that Malaysia has. So I think that's a very significant area And I think the other area Malaysia needs to possibly look at, Africa is the future when it comes to food security. So 60% of the world's arable land is to be found in Africa. And the realization I think that Malaysia and others has made in the pandemic is that you cannot be tied to a limited food supply value chain. And I think Malaysia has 2 or 3 major food suppliers, which I don't think in the long term is sustainable. So Africa very much provides that answer when Malaysia is looking for diversified food supply and global value chains. But also from South Africa's point of view, we provide a quality food product that can come in at a very competitive price. And I'm aware that there is work going on currently in the food sector where certain South Africans are helping the Malaysian government in trying to reach particularly the B40 market in Malaysia, people that can't afford food anymore because the prices have been rising so much. We're working with certain authorities in Malaysia to try through mosques, through supermarkets that service the lower income parts of the society to make sure that we can import food that would be affordable and of good enough quality for the lower income groups in Malaysia. So I think all these areas which provide us with many opportunities. And of course, then there's all the normal range of opportunities in oil and gas, in auto, in the defense sector, mineral beneficiation, the list goes on, of what we could be doing together in the future. But I think I've brought those particular ones up as areas where we can really benefit together if we work together on these things.
And I love so much that you took the time to explain this more in depth. You mentioned about the tourism aspect, about the halal sector, but also in the context of South Africa being the most diversified economy in the African continent, strong banking and financial and retail sectors. You mentioned about food security as looking at South Africa as the answer, providing quality, affordable food products to Malaysia. Hearing all of this, what do you think are the challenges, the barriers? And I remember vividly listening to a story of entrepreneurs saying that they would invest in parts of Asia, America, but somehow or other we talk about South Africa or Africa, by extension, that there's not much visibility amongst Malaysians when you're talking about this. What do you think are the barriers? Is this lack of promotion / marketing, or do you think there are actual structural barriers that are preventing Malaysians, be it entrepreneurs or students, from going to South Africa and doing business or studying? What do you think are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a bit of both, and primarily I would say it's a lack of knowledge. As I said, many Malaysians knew about South Africa, knew about Africa in the 90s and early 2000s. But somehow that intimate knowledge of what is happening in South Africa, what's happening in Africa, seems to have been lost over the past 15 or so years. And I think many Malaysians would be shocked if they had to go back now to see how South Africa has developed, how Africa has developed. I mean, there's the classic example of how in 2000, The Economist had this caption, this headline about Africa, the hopeless continent. But yet by 2018, I think it was, The Economist had a new headline saying Africa, the rising continent. So there's a lot that's going on in Africa in terms of the political changes, but primarily in terms of the economic changes. You generally find that in the list of top 10 GDP growth countries every year, there's at least 6 or so of the 10 that are African. And you see it across the continent. Of course, there are countries which still have problems, but across the continent in general, that you see a story of economic growth, you see a story of vitality, you see a story of innovation. The Africa today is leading the world in terms of technology, about how to use cell phones for payment, of how to use cell phones for business. And in other areas, Africa is leading the way. For example, in South Africa, the Square Kilometre Array is the biggest project globally that involves the use of big data. And it's the biggest project worldwide in terms of what's happening in studying the universe and space and so on. So I don't think people are aware of this because they've lost that intimate and in-depth knowledge about what's happening in Africa, what's happening in South Africa. Having said that, like all countries and like all continents, we do have our issues, we do have our problems, but I think we're finding solutions to those, and we're working towards a future that'll be far brighter and more prosperous than the Africa that many people think they know about. So you're right. I think it's a matter of changing the narrative, of getting people to look past the stereotypes and perceptions that might have existed, say, in the 1990s, to realize that those perceptions and stereotypes are no longer valid. And equally for the Malaysians that were investing in South Africa in the 90s, that were traveling to South Africa and to Africa, nothing's changed in terms of what attracted you then is still in place. There's still the strong banking sector. There's still the strong legal sector. There's still the strong business innovation environment. What's happened is that things have got better in other areas when it comes to the use of cell phones, and when it comes to the use of the whole digital economy, the fourth industrial revolution. All of those things are changing how business is done. And equally, the tourism products have changed quite significantly since the time that Malaysians were in South Africa. I've struggled to find any Malaysian that's been to South Africa since 2005. I think the only one that I found who's been since 2005 was actually His Majesty the King, who had been to South Africa for the 2010 World Cup. So I think it's really a matter of people getting to know the new African story, the more positive African story, and the South African story, which has a lot of good news items about it. But yes, your second part was the structural impediments. There are some structural impediments. For example, trying to break into the food sector in Malaysia is not easy. There's certain vested interests that don't like new competition. There's areas around the certification for halal certification that are unnecessarily stringent. We're not saying reduce the quality of your assurance, but there's ways of expediting that quality assurance where you've already recognized the halal certification bodies in South Africa, where South Africa has already for decades been selling into the Middle East, into the Gulf states, into Saudi Arabia and others. Surely it shouldn't take 5 years to register an abattoir when we have this track record, we have this history of providing good halal products at a competitive price. So those structural elements, I think, also can be looked at and worked on as we go forward.
And you know, this is why we do these interviews, so that we can get that great South African story out there, so people can learn about the potential opportunities. I mean, obviously there are challenges, but I think there are a lot more opportunities that can you know, they can be explored between Malaysians and then South Africans. Excellency, we are almost time, and I have one final question. This has been such an interesting interview. Most interviews, there's an exchange of conversation, but I think I was just happy to listen to you share, because I think there's so much that I did not know about South Africa, and I think you shed a lot of light on South Africa, be it the economy, tourism sector, halal sector was interesting. Now, the final question is, what is your call to action? And this is a diverse audience, so there are businesses, there are young leaders, government bureaucrats, policymakers. So what is your call to action to our audience that are interested in furthering, in getting to know, in advancing that South Africa-Malaysia relations?
I think that's a great way to round up. And firstly, let me apologize for dominating the conversation.
Not at all.
You said you normally have it more interactive. I apologize for dominating. I think the call to action is that, firstly, we need each other. There's much that we can do together that is in our mutual interests, whether it's working together in multilateral organizations like the Indian Ocean Rim Association, of how we better utilize our combined resources in the oceans economy, For example, how we guarantee maritime defense and security in the Indian Ocean and many other issues. Equally, as non-aligned movement in the United Nations, there's things like Palestine that we can work on together. We need each other also in terms of the food security, quite frankly, that we're both looking for, in terms of providing quality products at good pricing. We're both looking for trade opportunities. We're both looking for investment opportunities. And I believe there are projects and there are sectors which can provide both of us with what the Chinese call the win-win solution. So I think it's a matter of we should, on both sides, commit to looking at what worked in the past, examining why we were so strong together in the 90s and early 2000s, and committing to go back to that, of reprioritizing each other, of refocusing on each other, and realizing that it's in both our interests that we re-energize the relationship and take it to greater heights, be it economically, be it in the political sphere, or even, as you said earlier, be it in the cultural or the people-to-people cooperation spheres. There's much that we can and should be doing together. And I can assure you that Malaysian people will receive a very warm welcome in South Africa, just as Malaysians became tourists in the 90s, became investors in the 90s. You'll find that that South Africa that gave you such great returns in terms of enjoyment as a tourist, in terms of economic returns as an investor, you'll find that same South Africa is still sitting there waiting for you. And I know, having come to Malaysia a few times and seen Malaysia and the region that you're situated in, South Africans have an equally pleasant experience when it comes to touring Malaysia, touring ASEAN region, but equally doing business in the region. I'm sure there's the South African franchises that I've been interacting with that will very soon be trying to enter the Malaysian market. So I think that's really the main call to action, is let's give each other a chance again. Let's recognize that there's things that worked in the past that we need to have work again, and that it's really in both of our interests to do that into the future.
And I think that's an excellent way to close this interview. I wish we had more time to talk about other issues like you mentioned, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, on the collaboration on that front, South-South cooperation, Palestine struggle, prospects of a FTA. I wish we don't have time to go in depth, but I think maybe if you can do round 2.
I didn't even touch the defense cooperation. There's
exactly
quite a bit in defense cooperation as well.
Maybe we'll do a part 2 when you have maybe you clocked in some mileage as the High Commissioner a few months or maybe a year from now. We'll come back for part 2 and get an update on your progress as High Commissioner of South Africa to Malaysia. Maybe we can do a physical face-to-face where we can see you in person and do a round follow-up interview. But thank you so much for your time, High Commissioner. Before I end, just want to ask all of the audience listening to follow South Africa High Commission in Malaysia. There's 3 things you should follow. The first is the Facebook page, is at SA High Com Malaysia, and the handle is the same for Instagram, at SA High Com Malaysia. Follow both of those social media channels because they have very interesting updates on South Africa-Malaysia relations. And obviously, there's also the website, www.drco.gov.za/Malaysia. The links will be shown on the screen or in the show notes, and I hope all of you will take time to go to this interview. And if you've heard all the way to this end, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next DSW. Till then, see you soon, and thank you, High Commissioner.
Thank you, Zaim. Thank you, KSI.